Hello and welcome to Roundtable. When the world's nuclear watchdog says it can't be sure whether or not Iran is building a bomb, isn't it sensible to pay attention? Yet the United States and Europe appear to be ignoring the warning as they try to get a new deal before Iranian elections that could see a new hardliner as president. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Nuclear material that could be used in building a device is said by the International Atomic Energy Agency to have been found in 3 separate Iranian locations. So why press ahead with talks with Iran when it's accused once again of being dishonest? World powers, including the United States and European nations, are keen to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Back then, Tehran agreed to curb its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But in 2018, the Trump administration took the United States out of the agreement. Recent talks have not yet overcome obstacles like the removal of sanctions imposed in the last days of Trump's presidency. Iran will have a new government in August, with hardliner Ibrahim Raisi tipped as the likely winner of this week's election. However, ultimate power lies with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who backed the 2015 deal. The global nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, recently stated it cannot say for certain that Iran is not building a bomb. So what is at stake as Western powers push for a new deal? Time for us to be able to go into this in some detail because we head to Tehran and we welcome Mohammad Mousavi, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran, and then we go across to the United States, to Philadelphia to be precise, and we see John Ghazvinian there, Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, who specializes in the history of US-Iran relations. Now, Mohammad, I'm going to come to you on this one first, but John, this is also for you. When the International Atomic Energy Agency said it had found in 3 separate locations evidence of nuclear activity, but could not say whether or not Iran was or was not building a bomb, what was the reaction of the Iranian authorities?
Well, Iranian authorities are becoming very weary of this whole story. We have to remember that this has been going on for over 17 years now. And even according to US intelligence agencies, Iran has not sought the bomb after 2003. Now, they are insisting that Iran was after the bomb before that, but even during that period, Iran is saying that it was not after building a nuclear bomb. From Tehran's perspective, all of this is very political, and essentially, the West, particularly the United States, is looking for excuses to pressure Iran. I think it was in 2019 that the IAEA actually reported that over 80% of all the inspections that had done all over the world had been in Iran. And you know that they have 24-hour surveillance of Iranian nuclear facilities. So from Tehran's perspective, all of this is very political rather than technical.
Well, surely you would accept that if Iran was doing something that was against the spirit of the JCPOA, against any kind of agreement, and it clearly wants the sanctions to be lifted, it would deny that it was anywhere near building a bomb. And we also know that some of the facilities are several miles underground. So I'm wondering if we're surprised at the fact that Iran says it's surprised at the way the world's looking at it.
Well, regarding the fact that the Fordo facility is several kilometers in the ground is because Israel has repeatedly threatened to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. The main Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz has been threatened numerous times by the Israelis, and there was a lot of talk that they would bomb it, especially in 2009 and 2010. They even got the necessary bombs from the Americans. So what happened is after that, Iran built the next nuclear facility essentially in a mountain. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing covert operations, The IAEA actually has access to the Fordo facility, but nevertheless, it was built in and bombed so that the Israelis would not be able to bomb it. Um, Regarding the issue of what Iran's position on that is, we have to remember that cooperation and goodwill works both ways. So the IAEA cannot expect to get, special access in Iran that goes further than the NPT, which was what was happening
The non-proliferation.
until a few months ago under the additional protocol, when Iran is being sanctioned like never before. Iran is actually selling less oil today than it was before signing the nuclear deal in 2015.
Okay, I'm
So
going to go to John.
essentially,
I'm going to go to
okay.
John because I want to hear his voice before we get too deeply into the programme. First of all, from an American perspective, now there is a different man in the White House. Is there any trust in what Iran is saying at the moment?
I mean, I don't have any special insight into the thinking of this new administration, but I do think that they are coming at this, yes, with a little bit more of a spirit of goodwill and good faith than the previous administration. They are actually interested in the JCPOA inherently, rather than simply scrapping it and renegotiating it for some sort of mythical perfect deal that doesn't exist. So they are taking a more constructive approach. They're not emphasizing maximum pressure in the same kind of way. And they've been sending very subtly some positive signals in terms of the possibility of sanctions relief or other kinds of regional issues. On the whole, I think that the issue of trust is exactly the right one to put your finger on. And I agree with Professor Mousavi that, look, at the end of the day, this is an issue that would not be difficult to resolve in an atmosphere of trust and positivity and good faith. We've seen that before. We saw that during the Obama administration when both sides were able to, especially after 2013, were able to actually come together without the kind of the external pressures, political pressures, and actually negotiate a deal that was pretty reasonable in a lot of ways.
So let me go into this in a little bit more detail. Hamid is saying that it's 15 plus years ago since Iran made any advancements in the technology that it had at its disposal to build an atomic bomb. I don't know whether the United States really believes that or whether the IAEA actually believes that. So my question is Iran closer now to being able to have a device than it was before the sanctions were imposed in 2018, or is it further away?
That's a great question. It's in some ways the answer is both. I mean, look, it is true that technically speaking, Iran is closer to being able to build a bomb. At the end of the day, a lot of this stuff comes down to some very peculiar semantics, which I think are easily missed. I mean, yes, technically Iran is closer to being able to build a bomb, to having the capacity. That doesn't mean that they actually want a bomb, that that's actually what they're doing. The overwhelming majority of the evidence, including the evidence of America's own intelligence agencies, indicates that is not actually what they're interested in doing. And in fact, when you ask about 2003, it was 16 U.S. intelligence agencies and the National Intelligence Estimate, the highest level intelligence assessment of the United States, that indicated very, very clearly that there was no real indication that Iran was interested in a bomb, and that they had abandoned the possible military dimensions they were exploring to their nuclear program before 2003.
So here we have a situation, sorry to interrupt, here we have a situation where technically, yes, Iran possibly could advance further if it wanted to. It says it isn't. There isn't a lot of evidence that it is actually proceeding with this. We have somebody in the White House who probably trusts Tehran more than his predecessor did. So Hamid, what is in the way of a deal?
I think it's true that Iran is technically closer to being able to build a bomb, but nevertheless, as the professor indicated, it's a political decision to go after building a bomb. And that's not something that Tehran wants. Actually, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has issued a fatwa, an Islamic ruling against building a nuclear bomb. Now, we can look at that politically and say, well, he can change his mind. But the fact of the matter is that even from a public relations perspective, Iran has been telling its people as well as the whole world that it's not seeking a bomb. And if it actually changes that position, then that's going to have severe consequences in terms of legitimacy, even internally. So I don't
hang on a second, because we're going to hear from Ibrahim Raisi, the man who is quite likely to become the next president of Iran, and he's talking about the supreme leader and this issue.
I say this honestly. We view the JCPOA as an agreement with 9 articles that the Supreme Leader has approved. We will stay committed to the accord as an agreement and a commitment just like any deal which administrations have to be committed to.
So, Hamad, my question to you is, if the Supreme Leader is OK with the deal, if all the other things I've listed are actually the case, what is in the way of a new deal?
Well, there are several issues that have been very contentious between Iran and the United States. There's the issue of sequencing. Iran has insisted that since it was the Americans that left the deal, they should be the ones to return, and then Iran would fulfill its obligations. The Americans are saying that's not going to work. And I think the reason Iran is insisting on that is, again, the issue of trust, because when the Trump administration decided to leave the deal in 2018, the Europeans made a lot of promises to Iran that everything's going to be okay. And Iran actually continued to fulfill its obligations for a whole year. And during this time, the sanctions actually crippled Iran's economy. And the promises that the Europeans made that they didn't fulfill had a very negative effect on Iran's decision makers. So this time around, they are saying, no, we want the sanctions to be lifted in actuality, not on paper. So that's one major issue. The second issue is Iran is insisting that it wants all the sanctions that were implemented under the Trump administration to be lifted. And some of these sanctions were implemented under the labels of terrorism and human rights. But Iran is saying that they have to be removed as well, because if they are not removed, then Iran is not going to receive the benefits for its economy that it's supposed to under the deal.
Right, okay. We'll come back and we'll look at the attitudes of the hardliners, if you like, and the more moderate ones in just a moment. It seems to me, John, perhaps this is an issue of pride. If Ahmed is talking about sequencing, in other words, you did it first, therefore you've got to get out first before we do anything different, and you've got to lift all the sanctions at once. Are those things at all likely from a United States point of view?
That is the big question that remains to be seen. In fact, the issue is that there were hundreds of sanctions that were placed that the United States placed back onto Iran when it pulled out of the deal in 2018. But as Professor Mousavi correctly says, the Trump administration in its final months also added about 800 more sanctions unrelated to the nuclear issue. Removing these is just technically very difficult. It's not a simple thing. And as he says correctly, it's harder than ever because Iran is looking for some ironclad guarantees and mechanisms to be sure that they're not going to be reimposed at some point.
OK, John, I want you to listen to something from Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, with regard to precisely what you've just said.
I would anticipate that even in the event of a return to compliance with the JCPOA, hundreds of sanctions would remain in place, including sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. If they are not inconsistent with the JCPOA, they will remain unless and until Iran's behavior changes.
So there we have Blinken saying, unless and until Iran changes its behavior. What is it there that says there is any kind of trust on the United States part of Iran if it says it's got to change?
Well, I think if you look at those words closely, he's giving himself a little bit of wiggle room. We have to remember that we're in a negotiation at the moment, and what both sides will do in a negotiation is to take tough positions that can perhaps be softened, when the time comes. He's saying, as long as they are not inconsistent with the terms of the JCPOA, they will be repealed. Already he's indicating that there could be some room for repealing some of the non-nuclear related sanctions. And in fact,
unless
the US
and until Iran's behavior changes. What behavior?
Well, so what he's referring to there, I believe, is actually the sanctions related to the JCPOA, which is his way of saying Iran has to fulfill its obligations as well. Now, a lot of this is simply signaling on the sidelines of what is ultimately a technical and political discussion that is taking place in Vienna that we are not particularly privy to. They've kept a pretty tight lid on things. They're in the 6th round now of negotiations. It's unlikely that they're going to produce some sort of breakout deal, before the Iranian election this Friday. So I think we just have to wait and see.
Two issues here that I want to pursue in the second half of this program, which is where we are now. And Hamad, I'll come to you on this one first of all. Does it really matter, for the sake of the JCPOA, who is the president of Iran, as long as Ayatollah Khamenei remains the supreme leader, or will the influence of the president dictate events as well?
I think the president is definitely influential. If Iranian foreign policy would stay the same because of Ayatollah Khamenei, then we would have the same Iranian foreign policy during the time of Khatami's administration versus the time that Ahmadinejad was in power. And everybody knows that the foreign policy of Iran was actually very different during those two periods. And the reason for that is, even though the supreme leader is essentially the #1 figure of the country, the president still holds a lot of cards. He's the person who appoints the foreign minister. He appoints the secretary of the National Security Council. And by the way, he heads that council, which makes the most important decisions of the country. And also he serves as an advisor to the supreme leader. So I think it will definitely have an effect. Nevertheless, the issue here is the main contender in the election being Ayatollah Raisi. We have to figure out exactly what his position regarding the deal is, because he and the conservatives in general have been very critical of the deal since 2015. But now that they are coming into power, we are actually hearing much more positive signals from them. In fact, in the last presidential election, Ayatollah Raisi said that the JCPOA, as long as it serves Iranian interests, then it can be something positive. And that was very surprising for many analysts. And I think that was a signal that he would actually engage in negotiations if he becomes president.
Okay. Have a think about this while I go to John on a different matter. What influence will Iran's elite, as opposed to just the Ayatollahs and the hardliners, what would the business side of this, what would the pressure be like from them to go along with the JCPOA to get the sanctions lifted? That's coming up in just a moment. But John, I want to ask you, since the basis of this program was about what can the European Union do about this, can it be an honest broker between two very, very stubbornly seeming sides?
The European Union has demonstrated pretty consistently throughout all of this that it can act as a sort of bellwether between different positions, but I think that ultimately its powers are pretty limited. We saw that when the Europeans were trying to keep the Iran within the terms of the JCPOA after the US withdrew in 2018 by putting together this Instex mechanism that ended up being relatively meaningless, because at the end of the day, financial transactions have to go through the US ultimately, the sort of dollar U-turn, as it were. Europeans have inserted themselves into this picture from very early on because they helped to negotiate some of the very early Iranian suspensions to its nuclear program in 2003 to 2005. But I think they ultimately will be taking their cues from the other two sides.
But am I right in thinking it's not just from a political point of view, but that the EU wants to be at the top table, if you like? It is also because European businesses would like to do a great deal of business with Iranian businesses too.
Yes, I think that's actually the sort of elephant in the room that never gets talked about. I mean, I think a lot of European businesses for a long time have done very well out of U.S.-Iran hostility. I'm not trying to suggest any kind of conspiratorial motivations here. I think that the European governments are well-intentioned, but I think especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, Europeans were doing a lot of business with Iran while the U.S. was on the sidelines. I think today now that's moving more towards China, though.
Okay, so come back to the point I was making with you, Hamad. If European businesses have done quite well out of this and they're seeing their influence, if you like, fall off because of the sanctions, equally, Iranian businesses and very rich, influential people want to do the same with either people in the United States or people in Europe. Is there pressure coming from that side of things?
I think Iran's, especially the business section, has a very positive view of the Europeans. And As John pointed out, there was a lot of trade, especially with Germany and Italy and other European countries. Nevertheless, I think the position of the Europeans has been greatly harmed by the 4 years of the Trump administration. During that period, Iranian decision makers came to the conclusion that the Europeans essentially had no power because Trump was able to leave the deal without any sort of consequences. They weren't able to do anything about it. And I think the position now is the Europeans are is influential if they are able to sway the decisions in Washington. As long as they have influence in Washington, then that means that they are influential. If not, then their position is only a position of having symbolic negotiations and being sort of the host or the intermediary between Iran and the United
Okay,
States without actually having any power.
In Egypt, you have the army, which is a major influence on the decisions of wealth in the country because the army owns so much. In Iran, you have the Revolutionary Guard that has massive influence. I'm wondering if the very rich business people have any pressure that they are able to on the different sides, perhaps, to get this deal through or not.
I think, like everywhere, the business section always has its influences. I mean, just today, for example, Ayatollah Raisi visited the Iranian stock exchange and met with business leaders. And we don't know exactly the exchanges that took place, but we can expect that they talked about the nuclear deal as well. And in terms of the Revolutionary Guards, usually they don't take very public positions, but nevertheless, they are very close to Iran's supreme leader. They are also close to Ayatollah Raisi if he becomes president. So I think as long as the supreme leader and the president are okay with the deal, I don't think they will torpedo the deal or put barriers in front.
John, unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of the programme. I have found it absolutely fascinating. The one other question that remains for me to put is, who outside the obvious parties that we've just discussed has the most to gain if this deal does not go through?
And I suppose it depends on how you think about gain, but I think that the parties that feel that they have the most to gain are some of the close regional allies of the United States, specifically the Israelis, the Saudis, some of the Persian Gulf Arab states like the Emirates. I actually don't think it's in their long-term interests either to sort of benefit from sort of U.S.-Iran hostility. But there is a lot of anxiety in those capitals about the idea of Iran coming out of the cold and becoming closer to the United States and closer to the community of nations.
Let me pull one name out of that, and it's the obvious one. Will Israel be putting pressure on the Biden administration and others for this not to happen?
I think they've tried that. I think that there seems to have been some quiet conversations between the U.S. and Israel. There may be some rewards for Israel as well that we're not aware of yet for sort of keeping a bit more quiet. We've seen that in recent weeks. But there's also, of course, a new government in Israel. So I think Israel has its hands full, and it's not quite clear exactly what direction they're going to be going in terms of Iran and in terms of their relationship with the United States. But I will say this: I think they are more keen to repair the relationship with the United States and to sort of demonstrate that Netanyahu was not very good for U.S.-Israel relations. So I think they're going to be bending over backwards, this new government, not to upset the Biden administration.
Fascinating. Hamid, just wrap this all up. Do you think it'll happen? Will the deal be back in diplomatic circles working again before too long?
I think if a deal is reached in the next 45 days, which is before the new Iranian president takes power, then I think we will have a deal. But if a deal doesn't happen in the next 45 days, then I think the situation will become more complicated because there's a very good chance that Iran's negotiating team will change. And essentially what that means is that's going to make the timeline much longer. That doesn't necessarily mean that the deal is out of the picture, but essentially it can mean that it can take several months or even many months to reach a deal. Also, if I can add to the previous discussion, the issue of the position of the Israelis is very important because we have to remember that with the Israelis, they don't pressure Washington only through words, but they also take action by trying to sabotage the negotiations. They assassinate Iranian scientists. They launch cyber attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities. And what that does, essentially, it muddies the water. It brings the issue of trust to the forefront as well. Because, for example, when they assassinated
if only we had the time to go into the minutiae of this, and I know it is all extremely important, but we don't, unfortunately. What I learned in my reporting of the Middle East very early on is that whatever happens in and around that region, the ripples go out and affect many, many more people than you might originally have thought. Hamid, I think we seem to have had your picture frozen from Tehran, but we thank you anyway. I do hope you can hear me. Much appreciate you coming on. And John, thank you very much indeed. John Ghazvinian talking to us from Philadelphia. The door is open, seems to be the suggestion, but get your pens on paper before it's too late, because it might be closing, if not completely closed, in the next 45 days. We're talking about the Iran nuclear deal. From me, David Foster, from my guests. We thank you for watching, and we hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.